The murder of the Gren family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar, got to know their routine with the intent of kidnapping the children, 10-year-old Dylan, 8-year-old Shasta. Jed found the lock on the door was broken, entered the home in the middle of the night and tied up the mom, dad, and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive, sexually abusing, torturing and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan, but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is a CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station. Because you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter if you were an onlooker, link in description. Eventually, he took her to a diner where he was finally apprehended when a waitress noticed something was up and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. As he was dragged away, he called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison." Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer. But the worst part of it all is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them, as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of for years, meant the entire crews of both ships was slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia, and general mental deterioration, combined with already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2 to 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost and Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains discovered by local Inuit/Netsilik tribes, who described desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cook pots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. He actually fucking planned the whole thing 6 years in advance, got a building permit and built an inescapable apartment-like prison underneath his house. He drove miles to dispose of trash and do shopping for the imprisoned and not be recognized while doing so. Seriously ducked up. He was only found out because one of the children he fathered got seriously ill and had to be taken to the hospital after spending her whole 19-year-long life underground. He claimed that his daughter, Elizabeth, thought to have been abducted by a cult, dropped the granddaughter off at his house because she wasn't able to take care of the sick young woman. Doctors found the story fishy, involved authorities and demanded to speak to Elizabeth in order to find out what her daughter was suffering from. I'm on my phone, so please forgive my formatting. In the 80s there was a Mexican cult led by an American named Adolfo Constanzo. They used to kidnap random people from tourist towns and nearby cities and perform human sacrifice on them in their rural Mexican desert compound, usually torturing in elaborate rituals for hours or days before finally letting them die. These rituals included vivisections, cast rations, eyeball removal, tongue removal, teeth pulling, skin flaying, hanging, etc. They used amphetamines and cocaine to force the victim to stay awake during the torture and not pass out from shock. The cult believed the more pain and fear they could generate in the sacrifice victim, the more powerful the body parts would be as ritual trinkets and also for food for the cult's nganga, which is a large ritual cauldron used to store bones, blood, meat, and other valuable items that the cult believed gave them power. They used to make staves out of wired together spinal columns, and they would often eat the victim's eyeballs during the rituals. They are believed to have kidnapped and sacrificed over 26 people to their nganga in their 3 years that they were active from 1986 to 1989. The leader committed suicide when the police showed up at their compound. They arrested 14 cult members, but most people believe there were at least a dozen more that escaped and are still out there. Reminds me of a story. Dad, Mom, 3 kids decide they want to spend a weekend away at their cabin, but Dad has to work on Friday. They decide Mom kids will go on ahead without him and he will meet them at the cabin Saturday morning. Gigantic storm rolls through and suddenly a fucking tornado touches down. It destroys part of town, including the neighborhood where the family lives. Dad is a firefighter, so they are swamped with rescues, but Dad is happy his family is safe at the cabin. His truck finish their active calls and decide to take a drive around town to look for anyone needed help and see all the damage, and they drive down the family's street. The house is half destroyed, but more importantly, Dad spots Mom's car in the driveway. Mom, all 3 kids died because they had decided to wait for Dad as a surprise. There was over 25 deaths in total from the tornado. Dad ended up committing suicide a year or so later. The story was told to my dad when he went through first responder counseling by the firefighter Dad's old co-worker. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, you know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. TLDR, patient had a bug lay an egg in her eyelid and I removed the larva. The Cheshire murders. Family of 4 is followed for days by 2 guys. They break in one night by knocking the dad out and tying up his wife and 2 girls. The next morning, they dragged the wife to several banks to have her withdraw money. One bank realized something was up and asked if she needed help. She said no, that they would go away. Meanwhile, the police have already cornered the house and locked it down from a distance, but they're not moving because it's a hostage situation. The wife gets home and the two men begin to rape the girls while the husband is tied up in another room. The wife is then raped and murdered. While this is going on, the husband breaks free of his bonds and escapes to a neighbor's house. The two men realize that the dad escaped and kill the two daughters. Meanwhile, the police still do nothing until the husband finally contacts them and they move in. The whole thing went down over 2 days with the police in full knowledge of it happening. Yet they did nothing. The husband remarried and has a kid. He's also running for town selectman of Cheshire, CT, to make sure this never happens again. The war crimes that Unit 731, Japanese, have done, including but not limited to dissecting Chinese and Koreans' children alive, or vivisection, raping babies, syphilis and frostbite testing on Chinese, steaming Chinese alive, etc. Link in the description. The data that 78% of human body is made of water is partially a result of the 731 drying experiment, where Japanese scientists roasted Chinese civilians to death in a high-temperature room for 15 hours, then weighed the dried mummy body and compare it with the victim's body weight before the experiment. A story I heard from my grandpa is that they lured orphans with food because Chinese were starving during the long-lasting WW2, tricked them saying the injections were vaccines against flu while it's actually full of Stevia virus, then observed them slowly dying in agony, but continuously supplying them basic nutrition so they would last for as long as possible. The Nanjing massacre is just a cornerstone of the terrible war crimes conducted by the Japanese imperial armies, where half of the population from one of the most developed cities in China at the time were just wiped out in 10 days, bodies were burned for months. The world history has never witnessed such a cliff drop in population. The Imperial Japan did not consider Chinese, Koreans or Indonesians as humans, they're referring to them as monkeys and logs. Even the Auschwitz camp is acknowledged, but Unit 731 and the terrible biological warfares have never been acknowledged by Japanese up till today, not to mention apologies, even though there are evidences and memorials everywhere all over Asia. My grandpa always says history is written by the winners, but these horrible things really happened, people remember.